Thanks everybody for coming to the second Future Fixed Anchors Conference. Appreciate you. My name is Brady. I'm the Executive Director of the Access Fund. And we've got some incredible representation here. People came from around far and wide. I'm going to just call a few people out. One, thank you for Petzl for helping make this happen. Petzl is sponsoring this event. So bolting is one of the most controversial subjects in our sport. Point being that talking about bolting and fixed anchors used to be kind of the third rail of climbing politics, if you will. And it's something that it's clear to us at the Access Fund, I'm sure it's clear to all of you, that it's something that we need to embrace, something that we need to be willing to talk about openly and intelligently with ourselves and with land managers. And so, you know, in light of that, we've reconvened everybody. The world's changed a bit in the last 4 years. We were all really hot on this core drilling idea, at least some of us were. Kenny from the Nuremberg Gorge was never convinced, frankly. But so some of our techniques have evolved, and it's going to be interesting to talk about those changes. So why are we here? You know, climbing used to be a sport where we were all operating under the radar. And I think we all know that that is no longer the case. With fewer numbers, impacts were lower, land managers either didn't know what we were doing or could kind of ignore it. They could afford to ignore it. And now we're in a world where we've got climbing gyms sprouting up all over the place. People are learning to climb in places where there aren't even any outdoor climbing resources. We've got land managers who are climbers themselves, and we're starting to have some real impacts. So the world has changed, which means that the ethic of self-regulation that kind of came out of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where I think for a lot of climbers, and some of us still to this day, the reason we get into climbing is for the feeling of freedom, the feeling of possibility. And in such a headspace, people tend to not want to be told what to do. And so self-regulation, us kind of managing our own issues internally, was always the highest ideal. And the idea being, well, we'll take care of these things. Land managers, you don't have to worry about it. We'll kind of handle our own stuff internally. And you know, things have evolved. There was, I think in the 90s and 2000s, there was a lot of fear that climbing was just going to get shut down. It looked for a while that we weren't going to be able to place anchors in wilderness. That's largely, but not entirely, put to bed, I would say, at least on a national level. I think with the Park Service certainly has acknowledged that climbing is a legitimate use of wilderness and that we have a right to place anchors. So the scare of like climbing getting fully shut down, while not completely behind us, is on the decline, I'd say. And I feel like we're now moving into an era where we're not feeling like, okay, land managers, leave us alone. We just can manage everything ourselves. We're not feeling like climbing is going to be made illegal on a grand scale in the country. Now we're at this place where we're going to have to work, and we have the opportunity to work in partnership with land managers, to have partnerships with local climbing organizations, with managers, to better manage the resource. So it's kind of self-regulation in a sense, in that we're helping the land managers regulate ourselves. So the world's changed a lot. And you know, one of the things that's changed is back in the day, climbers could just pretty much place any bolt they wanted, wherever they wanted, however they wanted to do it, because they were under the radar. And we all know that that's not the case anymore. Who here has clipped a bolt that was sketchy or didn't inspire confidence?
I climb with leg straps all the time.
Has anybody pulled the bolt out with their hand, looked at it, looked around your other options, put it back in, and kept climbing?
Oh yeah.
Look at that. There's like 10 of us. All right. So I mean, this is an expert group. I mean, I don't have to tell you that there's a problem out there. But if you do the math, I'd say that, I'll take a step back. I'd say there's kind of two eras of bad bolts. There's the bad bolts from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that's what Greg's been focused on largely. The little quarter inchers with the leaper hangers. That you just look at it and you know instantly it's bad. And so there's still a few of those lurking out there. lot.
More than a few.
More than a few. There's still more than a few. But there's this whole other category of bolts that were placed in the 90s during the sport climbing revolution, and we just didn't have a standard. And those are starting to get bad too. We had a terrible fatality in Owens River Gorge recently, and you can debate whether or not you should ever be relying on a single anchor, but the truth is that when we go sport climbing, a lot of times we're taking big whippers on one bolt, and if that failed, it would be catastrophic. So there's this whole other era of bolting that now needs to be addressed, and if you do the math, there's hundreds of thousands of bolts placed, hundreds of thousands, and to replace those with stainless steel is roughly $10 a head, conservatively, not paying any labor, just assuming there's somebody who's willing to go out and do that. We got millions of dollars of hardware alone on our hands to kind of re-equip our sport. So there's this huge issue, and the failures it isn't an epidemic yet, but it's happening. And so I think that's another reason why we're here today. Certainly stress corrosion cracking got everybody's attention in the tropics, but we've got other kinds of issues that we have to address. So we'll be diving into a lot more of that today, and sharing some of the great work that you all are doing. I mean, I want to just be clear that what's the Access Fund's role in this? I mean, one of the things that we can do is convene people. A lot of you have got hundreds of hours of experience out in the field, rebolting, placing bolts, and really this is about trying to convene everybody to let the best information, best practices come forward so that so that we know what we're doing when we're out there. So what this isn't an ethical or stylistic debate. Let's try to avoid that. We did a great job of that 4 years ago. I don't see any problem with that today. Let's try not to rehash old controversies. Let's look forward. This is about sharing best practices, tips and techniques, sharing science and new technologies, getting smart on the policy landscape. It's good to know, it's important to know what the regulations and the rules and the laws are that govern what we're doing. Getting smart on the legal and liability concerns. Increasingly, as we get more sophisticated about rebolting, and there's organizations with boards of directors and organizations, or there's some organizations that are so bold as to stamp their name on every hanger. So did you run that past your attorney, Greg, before you started doing that? No, okay.
We got right.
So increasingly, there's a real concern about, well, if I do this, if we do the right thing, am I going to lose my shirt if something bad happens? So we want to dive into that. And what I'd like to do, and I was afraid of discussing this, to be honest with you, 4 years ago, because I know through experience that getting a bunch of climbers together in a room and standing on a soapbox and telling people what to do is it's a losing strategy. But I would like to see us come out of here, or soon, come out with a standard. With us as a community really saying, this is what is an acceptable bolt, and this is what isn't. The UIA is working on that. We have a whole panel on that. And when we convened people 4 years ago, there's still a lot of people, maybe there's still some people in this room today, and if you're one of these people, it's okay. But I'm here to tell you that mixing your metals is just a bad idea. And there are a lot of people who, 4 years ago at the conference, were really resistant to the concept that there was anything wrong with placing a plated bolt on a stainless steel hanger. That was, I did it 20 years ago. The bolt looks fine now. Like, what's the problem? Well, it's a real problem. And so, and people are still placing junk today. Jim Titt, who can't be here, I think he lives in Germany, and he's one of the world's authorities on bolting. He gave a great talk, which is actually available online if anybody cares to listen to it after this conference, talking about how nobody complains when there's a standard for ropes. Like when your rope is rated to a certain number of falls, climbers aren't going to the hardware store buying clothesline, braiding it into something, and taking whippers on it. We're just not. If you did, you'd be laughed out of town. However, climbers are still going to a hardware store buying bolts and putting them in the rock with no standards, no testing, and in a situation where one thing could fail and somebody could die. And culturally, we've kind of accepted that. And I think things are moving And I think the time has come for us to say, you know what? We've got standards on harnesses, we've got standards on ropes. When we've got a situation where one anchor failure could result in an injury or death, we as a community need to get our heads wrapped around the fact that maybe we need to spend an extra buck per bolt to make sure that it's safe not just for us, but for everybody that comes after us. Because ultimately, when we're putting up roots on public land, like it or not, it's a public action. Some people say, you know, I don't put up roots as a public service, I put them up for myself, and if they're great and the bolt's bad in the future, somebody else can come by and rebolt it at somebody else's problem. I would just say that, you know, we have a responsibility to be a little bit bigger than that. You know, climbing and establishing roots is a great privilege, and we need to acknowledge as a community that that is a public act. And like it or not, every route you put up on public land is a public service route in some ways. And so with that comes some responsibilities. We're still in a position where land managers, for the most part, haven't told us what we can put in the rock. They're starting to do that. And when they come to us and say, there's all these bolts that are kind of showing up, and not just climbers. Now the slackliners are starting to put up their own anchors, which is happening in Jefferson County. And it was actually the Jefferson County outside of Golden, Colorado, just went through a whole revision of their climbing management policies. And largely, one of the things that kind of precipitated that was that the slackline community was putting up bolts that they didn't recognize as being good. Drilling big holes, putting threaded rod in there and then gluing them in. And some of them were climbers, so that didn't look good. When a land manager says, is what you're putting in okay, and we don't have an answer for that, that's a problem. Because then they're going to start making things up. Or they're going to go to whatever source they can find to determine the standards. So even if you disagree with my first premise, which is that putting up roots on public land is a public act, even if you want to throw that away and say, Brady, I don't buy that. Well, okay, we can agree to disagree on that, but it's just a good strategy for us to get a standard set within ourselves before one is set for us. So, and that was something I was afraid to say 4 years ago, because I thought I'd get run out of Dodge. Maybe I'm risk averse. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. I think one last thing, and this is something I said 4 years ago. The other thing I encourage us to think is 10, 20, 100 years out. There's a few places in one of my favorite climbing areas where you can see the evidence of either old bolt wars or the evidence of the kind of prevailing technology changing over time. Well, that hole was when they put a quarter wrench in it, and then that hole was a 3/8 wedge, and now there's a nice half-inch stainless there, which will hopefully be there for a long time. But I think there's a chance that in 40, 50 years, maybe much sooner, when climbers see the old scars and patched holes from our era, it'll look like the old pin scars in Yosemite on like Serenity Crack does to us today. Evidence of a bygone era where the climbing community kind of had to get their head wrapped around sustainability. Do we need to reuse every hole in every situation? No. Is that practical? No, it's not. But I think we need to think about what is Craig going to look like 100 years from now. The footholds are going to be more polished. That's something for some other people to worry about. When they, you know, like the retexturization of the American climbing, Craig, that's another generation's problem. That's not our problem. But putting a bunch of holes and just putting junk in the rock and just kind of thinking it's going to be okay, that is our problem. And I think, especially for some of these iconic areas where, you know, these climbs are historic treasures, it's our responsibility in the future to see our actions of stewarding and making sure the anchors are safe as a historic preservation kind of action. And elevating our craft to the point where it really is an art form, I think is great. And again, that doesn't mean we have to do it every time, but if we have, and if we refine, it's like some of you in this room have been doing, these techniques to the point where it becomes an art form, and to the point where actually rebolting is harder and trickier than the first ascent even, then we've really achieved something. So I'm going to leave it at that.